Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Radical Politics, on the Causes of Contemporary Emancipation, by Peter D. Thomas. Read by John Keating. O wonder! How many goodly creatures are there here! How beauteous mankind is! O brave new world, that has such people in it! The Tempest, Act 5, Scene 1, lines 203 to 220. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde. Introduction. Radical Politics Against the New World Order. Besides, it is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time, and a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world it has hitherto inhabited and imagined, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past, and in the labour of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. Hegel's reflections in the midst of the great events that inaugurated global political modernity, a revolution against slavery, the dissolution of the feudal order, the vindication of the rights of women, among so many others, might seem to speak also to the immense political transformations of our own times. The early years of the 21st century have witnessed wave after wave of protests and rebellions against the New World Order that was proclaimed with the fall of the Soviet bloc, and the consolidation of what has become known as neoliberalism on a global scale. From the clarion call of the Zapatistas' uprising in the early 1990s, the alternative globalization movement straddling the turn of the new century, anti-war protests throughout its first decade, the pink tide of progressive governments in Latin America, revolutionary upsurges in the Arab Spring, anti-austerity campaigns, and the intersectional socio-political movements that have defined popular responses to the latest round of capitalist crisis internationally, the depoliticization and neutralization frequently foretold or feared by the auguries of both right and left over the last 30 years, have failed to appear. Recent decades have instead witnessed a proliferation of radical emancipatory social and political movements. They have been radical, not in the sense of merely extreme, such as when, example, the term is used to characterize supposedly radical right-wing politics, but in its more profound sense, as a fundamental questioning of the nature and causes of the manifold experiences of injustice within the current order. To be radical, as Marx wrote, is to grasp the root of the matter. In a world such as ours, that continues to be structured by generalized relations of exploitation, subjugation, and subalternization, to be radical means, in the first instance, to work for emancipation from all such conditions, wherever they are encountered. It is precisely this task that the most dynamic of contemporary movements have set themselves. Sometimes, these radical emancipatory movements have been punctual, and sometimes delayed, sometimes ephemeral in appearance, and sometimes subterranean in effect. But their stubbornly persistent emergence and re-emergence signifies the development of new forms of conflict and struggle of the popular or subaltern social groups and classes. The new century seems to be characterized by a progressive accumulation of accelerated political cycles on a variety of terrains and in different geopolitical regions, as if it were only through the exhaustion of spirit in one of its incarnations that it might gather the strength to spring forth afresh elsewhere, clothed in different garbs, yet cut from the same cloth. these movements of resistance and revolt may not have issued in many unambiguous victories. Their failures may not even have been of an important type, and the significance of whatever modest successes these movements may have enjoyed in their own moments has been continually found wanting, when measured against standards derived from previous and wholly different political conjunctures. At the beginning of each upsurge of struggles, it has not been difficult to hear voices hopefully declaring the end of a long season of defeats, and the opening of a new chapter in the universal history of the forward march of popular movements. Retrospect, even at a short remove, seems quickly to deflate such enthusiasms, seeing in what was yesterday's novelty merely an eventual exception that does not disprove the continuing rule of the party of order. Indeed, in some cases, it even appears to have been strengthened, particularly when xenophobic, racist, and nationalist mobilizations or revivals of the far right have been able to fill the vacuum left by the defeat or demobilization of emancipatory projects. The spectacular eruption and subsequent fierce repression of revolutionary initiatives in the Arab Spring constitutes the most tragic and significant example of this negative dialectic. The brief flowering of the Occupy movement in the heart of the imperialist powers in the early years of the second decade of the century, and its equally rapid dispersion in both figurative and literal senses, followed something of the same pattern, albeit on a lesser scale. In a longer-term perspective, the sequential election of progressive governments in Venezuela, Brazil, and Bolivia raised hopes for the inauguration of a socialism for the 21st century. In each case, initial enthusiasms more or less gradually subsided, when they were not abandoned, as those movements and their domestic and international supporters confronted the sober realities and contradictions of governing what remained of societies fundamentally structured by capitalist social relations, of socialization, just as much of production. In a similar fashion, the hopes of the European left have migrated over the last decades, with specific, nationally based political formations appearing to represent, at least for a season, a paradigm for a more general continental recomposition of progressive forces. These exemplary instances have included Rifondazione Comunista in Italy, at the height of the movement of movements in the early years of the century; Die Linke in Germany, in the wake of the movements against the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq at the midpoint of the first decade; the foundation of the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste in France in 2009, embodying hopes for leftist recomposition that was soon dashed; Syriza's revolt against the creditors in Greece, before its capitulation to the Troika's dictates in 2015; Podemos's ongoing traversal of the contradictions of the austerity-riven and disintegrating Spanish nation-state; or the enthusiasm for Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party in the UK, echoing and echoed by the mobilizations around Bernie Sanders' bids for the presidency in the United States. Most recently, this accumulative cycle has been shadowed by a revival of the extreme right across the continent and around the globe, not entirely incomparable to the dynamics of the 1930s. We seem to live in something of an interregnum, as elements of the old tenaciously hold back the emergence of the new, as hopes are raised, and just as soon dashed, hanged on the expectation of plenty. As Antonio Gramsci noted in a very different period, with a formulation that seemed to become ubiquitous since the global financial crisis in 2007 to 2008, The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying, and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Yet whatever strange beasts slouch toward Bethlehem today, and however much reactionary currents seem to have grown in strength in recent years in particular national contexts, at least one thing seems to be clear when considering the global situation over the longer, extended generational period that runs from the 1990s until today. Something fundamental has shifted in the exhausted structures of feeling and response that were dominated by the experience of defeats for emancipatory politics in the final phases of the 20th century. The type of left melancholia that corralled critical political energies for more than a generation no longer exerts the same mesmerizing fascination that dominated so many leftist responses from the 1980s onward. For those who have been active in the movements and mobilizations of the nascent oppositional political cultures of the last decades, such an orientation can only seem strangely dated, if not even narcissistic. From these younger standpoints, the horizons of the present no longer appear as pale reflections of the past, or menacing shadows of its traumatic repetition, but are populated by figures of the new and of the unexpected. This novelty derives in the first instance from changed conditions of contemporary politics, characterized by a unique conjugation of crises on multiple fronts. Expansive capitalist globalization in a unipolar world, accompanied by increasing imperialist interventionism around the globe, accelerating environmental catastrophes on an apocalyptic scale, coinciding with the pulverization of autonomous institutions of popular industrial and political organization, the redefinition of the sites of injustice, and its contestation occurring alongside technological reconfigurations of social space and time. But the distinctiveness of this period also owes something to the way in which contemporary movements have confronted its challenges as discrete instances of protest, nevertheless in some way linked together in their revolt against everything that is the contemporary itself. Albeit unevenly, failing and recommencing in turn, frustratingly patient in their broken rhythms, our times are marked by a revival of popular struggles and new political practices on a scale not witnessed since the long 1960s. Piece by piece, the new world order seems to be dissolving before our eyes. A new product of spirit, Hegel might have said, is being prepared. Contemporary emancipatory politics. It is not surprising that the punctual tempo of recent political movements and their cycles has given rise to more provisional and strategic forms of thought than the type of melancholic brooding over epical transformations that so entranced an earlier generation. How is this particular movement to be built in the here and now? What are the social groups and actors most likely to become involved in this initiative? How can they be encouraged to move from passive support to active participation in the movement's development? These are questions that, in the simplicity of their formulation and their orientation to the resolution of particular problems, are both more particular than any periodizing narrative, but also more general than any temporal distinction. It is almost as if these movements, in their commonalities and in their differences, have been searching for responses to the questions posed by the conjunctures themselves, questions simultaneously generic in their import, yet specific in each of their modes of formulation. It has been the repetition of these questions, different in their sameness, which has been the most striking continuity across the specificities of each discrete political cycle. It is almost as if, unsatisfied, these questions demand to be revisited, reformulated, and reposed in each new movement. The emergence of every wave of protest and resistance over the last 25 years has posed the problem of attempting to translate experiences and insights from immediately preceding cycles, not simply or even primarily in terms of their responses, but perhaps even more in terms of their modes of posing these questions. It is a dialectic of simplification and clarification that descends down, or ascends up, toward the basic problems of political action, grasped in the specific formulations of the contemporary conjuncture. At least 4 such questions have been repeatedly posed in distinct but related forms by the movements of the last 25 years. These 4 questions focus on the goal, nature, method, and organizational forms of political action. I propose to consider the articulation of these questions as a potential etiology of contemporary emancipation. Etiology is today perhaps most commonly associated with a medical vocabulary, a sounding of the depths that correspond to the surface symptoms identified by its twin science of pathology. Other listeners may recall its usage in Freud's early attempt to delineate a foundational method for what would only later become psychoanalysis. In this book, it is instead intended as one of its original Greek and above all Aristotelian meanings, that is, an account of the final, material, efficient, and formal causes, aetiae, of radical political engagement. It is true that a notation of causation derived from a thinker who infamously justified slavery as both natural and necessary may not seem, at first sight, to be the most promising way to focus on the challenges of contemporary emancipation. The great strength of the Aristotelian tradition, however, is that it enables us to avoid the reductions of those modern notions of cause, frequently inspired by David Hume's approach, that consider it in a restrictive sense as an origin of a potential effect, with the various intentionalist or even subjectivist deviations that follow from this premise. The more expansive notion of an etiology, a study of a thing's causes, or the modes of explaining its constitution, offers us a more differentiated sense of all those features that can help us to explain why and how something has come to be that which it is, or even more importantly, why and how it might have the potential to become something else. The 4 questions of such an etiology of contemporary emancipation can be formulated in a condensed fashion in the following ways. First, in terms of emancipatory politics' final cause, or the end that it seeks to achieve, what is the terrain on which emancipatory political activity today should concentrate its efforts? Should the seizure of state power still constitute the immediate or even ultimate goal of political action? Or has the centrality of traditional state power been superseded or displaced by the emergence of other rationalities or regions of political, social, ethical power and its contestation? Second, regarding the material cause of emancipatory politics, or the stuff of which it is made, what constitutes the distinctive nature of emancipatory politics? Can it be conceived as the sublation, completion, or inheritor of political modernity? Or is it properly understood as oppositional and antagonistic to all forms of political order hitherto? Third, in terms of emancipatory politics' efficient cause, or the way in which it is done, What methods of political work might help emancipatory political movements to be built? Are these methods to be derived from known models of political action? Or do the goals of these movements necessitate a different way of conceiving how politics itself might be done? And fourth and finally, as the formal cause of emancipatory politics, or that which gives it its distinctive shape, what are the forms of organization most likely to deepen and extend the dynamics that led to the emergence of these movements of resistance and rebellion in the first place? Can a form of the political party still be enabling? Or would contemporary political activity be better comprehended, theoretically and practically, in terms of other forms of organization, association, and relationality? Translating Gramsci. This book explores the ways in which the implicit and explicit responses of the political movements of the 21st century to these four questions might be brought into productive dialogue with the thought of Antonio Gramsci and the various conflicting interpretive traditions that have grown up around it. It is admittedly not immediately obvious why a reference to a figure from the past, however interesting on their own terms, may be the most useful way to pose these questions. If we wish to clarify the conditions and potentials of contemporary emancipatory movements, would it not make more sense to begin instead directly from the debates that are actually happening today? Doesn't such a return to a known thinker risk becoming yet another flight from the contradictions of the present, rather than an attempt to resolve them in the active construction of a different future? Yet, a historically significant figure such as Gramsci has a claim on our attention today for a variety of reasons, each of them compelling in its own way, and none of them exhaustive on its own, of his multifaceted contemporaneity. Gramsci appeals to readers today, for instance, due to his undoubted historical importance as one of the most sophisticated theoretical expressions to have emerged from the plurality of experiences, struggles, and discourses, often too rapidly condensed into the myth of a unitary or purportedly classical Marxism and its supposedly Western aftermath. Similarly, while not as clearly canonical as his near contemporaries Max Weber or Carl Schmitt, at least for some influential currents of academic discussion, Gramsci is undoubtedly today ranked among the major political thinkers of the 20th century. The fact that the most recent philological and historical studies have substantially increased our knowledge of his thought, revealing previously unnoted sources, structures, and implications, suggests that revisiting the prison notebooks today could prove to be generative of new insights and perspectives, not only for the history of political thought, but also for contemporary emancipatory politics. Gramsci's continuing significance is due not only to his formative influence on the political culture of the New Left, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, and many of its later derivations and afterlives, including cultural studies, post-colonial theory, and subaltern studies. Equally, the ongoing diffusion of some of the key themes and concepts of the prison notebooks, above all, that of hegemony, across almost all humanistic and social scientific academic disciplines, and a global prominence in all the major linguistic cultural zones of theoretical debate, is not the only reason that he might be regarded as an unavoidable point of reference. Finally, it is not only because Gramsci's thought has constituted an important reference for some of the most dynamic political movements and formations of our time, from Venezuela to Bolivia, from Greece to Spain, that he might be thought a fitting interlocutor for an attempt to reflect on the theoretical and practical challenges that those movements have posed. The argument of this book is both more general and more specific. In terms of the former, I wish to demonstrate that a reading of some of the central themes associated with Gramsci's thought, and the debates that have shaped its reception, can provide us with clarifying critical perspectives on these four central questions regarding the distinctive goals, nature, method, and organizational forms of emancipatory politics. There are immediate historical reasons why a thinker such as Gramsci is particularly well placed to help us to respond to questions of this nature. For whatever his various afterlives and the truncated political, national, and disciplinary receptions to which his writings have been subjected, Gramsci was above all else a political practitioner and professional revolutionary, directly engaged in seeking answers to similar questions in the movements of his own time. All of his writings, both before and after his imprisonment, remain inextricably tied to this context. The extensive reflections on seemingly other forms of social life that define the encyclopedic nature of the prison notebooks, literature, culture, history, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and folklore, among many others, were not subordinated to this primacy of politics, but enabled by it. As historical documents, the distinctive answers that Gramsci provided to the questions posed by the world historical events in his own period undoubtedly continue to have a cardinal importance in the record of revolutionary movements in the 20th century. It is only in this optic that any true measure can be taken of the nature of Gramsci's achievements in his own historical context. Yet in the prison notebooks, Gramsci aimed to produce a political theory that could not only explain the determining features of his particular historical moment, one marked by the involution of a revolutionary upsurge and the rise of extreme forms of fascist reaction. He also sought to comprehend the deeper historical processes that had produced and were condensed in that distinctive moment. By so doing, he formulated not a philosophia politica perennis, at the heights of universalist abstraction, nor simply a description of the conditions that obtained in Italy and Europe in the interwar years, in a modestly nominalist fashion. Rather, he produced what can be regarded, using his own terms, as a translatable theory of the possibilities of emancipatory political action in societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production, and structured as processes of subalternization. The translatability of the political theory of the prison notebooks derives not from its presentation of an ensemble of generic concepts, immediately good for all seasons. Their translation must be actively attempted, based in the first instance on their potential for meaningful reformulation in the vocabularies of the present. The intensity of Gramsci's immersion in the particular concrete conditions of his own time enabled him to outline a singular critical perspective on political modernity as processes of subalternization and their contestation. Part of the reason that so many different political and national conjunctures over the last 70 years have repeatedly thought to find in Gramsci a guide to action may be because such subalternization remains the destiny against which emancipatory politics constitutively and necessarily struggles. One dimension of this book will therefore explore the extent to which such a critical perspective on subalternization, drawn from Gramsci's carceral research, might be translated once again today, in order to clarify some of the central debates of contemporary emancipatory politics. The strategic method of hegemony. The fundamental argument of this book, however, is that there is also a more specific reason why Gramsci might be productively translated in relation to the questions that have emerged within contemporary movements.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?